focus tonight simply on reading comprehension and review. So I put together this class upon request. I have in the past taught some other classes going deep on reading comprehension as well as on logical reasoning review. And so I'm going to share with you some links to those in the chat here so that I won't just simply rehash things I've covered in the past. When I think about review with either logical reasoning or reading comprehension, I'm thinking about what I call the Socratic review method. And so in one of my previous classes, I've gone in depth on the Socratic review method in the logical reasoning context. So much of that applies to reading comprehension as well, simply with a longer stimulus. Instead of a stimulus, we actually have a passage, but the process is largely the same. So I'll just briefly recap that. I'm sure many of you have heard me cover this before, so I'll cover it briefly now just to get everyone up to speed. With the Socratic review method, you want to ask yourself a series of questions to determine where your misunderstanding stemmed from. Was it in the passage? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the choices? If it was in the passage, you want to determine what it was about your approach to the passage that made it difficult. Maybe there was confusing wording, maybe they referred to something backwards, or maybe it was just your approach overall in terms of your note-taking strategy, highlighting, underlining, annotating of any sort, summarizing along the side, or if it was just the content itself. There's a lot of things it could be. You want to figure out specifically where your misunderstanding came from if it was in the passage. If it was in the question stem, obviously there's some work to do there in terms of figuring out what exactly it was they were asking, what they were driving towards. Was it a main idea question? Was it a strength and weaken question? Was it a parallel question? Reading comp can get pretty weird sometimes, and so you want to figure out if it was one of those more difficult question types or if it was actually simply a more standard type, but presented in an unfamiliar way, in a way that you may not have grasped. Or if it was in the answer choices, which is so often where it actually is. You want to figure out what was tempting about the wrong answer that made it seem appealing and what ultimately made it wrong. And if it was something in the right answer that made it seem unappealing, what it was there too. So what tempting wrong answers and discouraging right answers. One or both of those may be at play. And you got to figure out what the trick was and where the actual truth was. And so you got to repeat this process several times, both in logical reasoning and reading comprehension. It takes a lot of time. A common challenge or a common question I get about this is it worth it? Because it can take a really long time. It can be grueling. And this means that if you take this approach, you may not be able to get to as many questions. You may not be able to do as many full-length timed exams, so be it. I would rather you do half the number of exams or 1/10 of the number of exams, but review them in more depth. And so I've laid out that review process. I put the details of that process in the chat, so you don't have to try and transcribe everything I'm saying. It's all there in text. I also have covered this, of course, elsewhere as well. It's in the notes for that logical reasoning Socratic review method video as well. A couple of other brief notes, and then I'll get into some examples here. Timing. Common mistake with reading comprehension is trying to time things too early and also trying to time things too specifically. 8:45 per passage is simply an average amount of time, simply an average. No particular passage should take exactly 8:45. Some will ideally take 6 minutes. Others might take 10 or 11 minutes or 12 minutes, and that's totally fine. It's to be expected. Nothing wrong with that. So I never really recommend timing yourself to individual passages. Either do a full section of 4 within the 35-minute time constraint or more if you have extra time accommodations, but don't get so granular as to time individual passages, and also don't get so granular as to time individual questions. I've seen a lot of things out there talking about how some passages, if they have more questions, give yourself more time. If they have fewer questions, give yourself less time. I don't love that because the number of questions associated with a passage is not the sole determinant of how long it might take you. The level of complexity in the passage itself may also be a massive determining factor. There are some passages on really weird topics like mirrors or on riddled basins of attraction, weird physics stuff that nobody's ever heard of before. Those will take a long time, even if there are only 5 questions. The number of questions doesn't tell you if you should do the passage first, doesn't tell you if you should do it last. I think if anything, the complexity of the passage and the topic, or at least the theme, natural science, social science, humanities, law, all of that will determine, put together, how long it should take. But there are so many factors that simply coming across it on a quick 10-second or 20-second gut check, that's not going to be long enough to really tell you how long it should take or the exact order in which you should approach things. So take any timing for individual passages with a big grain of salt. If you wanted to, as an exercise, simply summarize the passages and then attempt to solve the questions simply using your articulation or summary of the passage and nothing more. So again, as an exercise, you simply summarize the passage, you summarize the viewpoints, and then you go on immediately to the questions, never looking back at the passage text, only using your summaries. Obviously, this isn't going to carry you all the way, and nor should it. I mean, in real test day conditions, obviously you can go back to the passage, and you probably should, but as a way to test your retention and to test your summaries, how you boil it down, could a summary be enough to at least get you a good part of the way with the main idea question, the primary purpose question, the passage organization question, all the questions that are general or global in nature? That would be a good exercise to engage in. Let's see what else. Another exercise you could do is, rather than simply relying upon summaries, rely only on your memory, not even any notes at all. And this is really good if you're thinking about how much do you want to do with regard to note taking and highlighting and underlining. I've said many times, I find those who do best on reading comp mark very little or not even at all. And so if you're thinking you're the kind of person who might not want to mark at all, what would that look like? And what could you do if you not only didn't mark, but also didn't return to the passage at all? Again, just an exercise, not to really time yourself too strictly. Obviously, it will take you significantly longer and you'll be pretty unsure of things. But again, it's a good way to play with the boundaries a little bit, to play at those edges, to see what is it like to not go back at all? What is it like to have nothing in front of you, relying only on memory? And I would imagine there might be even be some utility to do this in a place like games, where you don't look back at the initial text, only your diagrams, only your rules. Again, playing with the short-term working memory, testing your limits. And I see a question from Judy here. How do you achieve better retention of details? And that's really, I think that's the name of the game. That's the entire question here. One idea that comes to mind is to note where the details are so that you can go back and find them when you need to. I've said this many times, I'll say it again. If you're thinking that main ideas, the author's opinion are articulated, let's say at the end of paragraph 1, you know where that is. And then middle of paragraph 2, tons of details, long lists of technical things. I wouldn't think it's that useful to try and memorize all of that in the moment, because it's automatically going to push past your comfort level and push past the boundaries of what you're able to retain in the moment. So I'd say don't even try. It's too much. And obviously that'll knock detailed questions out of the running if you're not going back to the passage, but real world test day conditions you are. And so note where that is to go back and find it when you need to. That may not work for everybody. With everything I'm saying here, really, it may not work for everybody. Reading and comprehension is much more personal than any other section of the exam. And so anything I'm saying, try it out. If you don't like it, don't use it. I would say the best test is to simply experiment. And even those of you taking the LSAT August 29th or thereabouts, you've got over a month. We're speaking now towards the end of July, but you've still got at least 4 or 5 weeks to play around with things, to test it out and see what is it like to do a handful of sections one way, a handful the other way. So a handful of sections where you use the highlighting tools, you use the underlining tools. Another handful where you don't. What feels better to you and what gets you a higher accuracy rate? At the end of the day, that's what really matters, right? And so play around with it, but I think there's simply too much to memorize everything in the moment. These are meant to be uncomfortable topics. They're meant to push you past your limits. And so keep in mind that what some people would call a roadmap. I like the word. I don't like the people who use the word, but roadmap to me means you're having an idea of where to go back and find things when you need to. So note where the details are and go back to them. But the summaries I showed you, that's a good way to at least digest it. I think there's a lot of value in writing things out to retain them better. People talk about in study skills, the more sensory input you can use, the more real and concrete it becomes for you. And so one way to learn is to read, another is to write, another is to speak. And so those of you who like taking notes, as you're taking notes as I'm speaking, you're writing it down. So you're moving it from hearing and only auditory to physical, moving your hand on paper or with a pen or typing. Then again, as you read what you wrote down, you're then adding a visual component as well. So the more senses you use, the more your retention increases. On test day, that means if you like writing summaries, then actually physically writing by hand on your scratch paper will be a good way to make it from visual only, reading on the screen, to physical, writing it down with your hand. And then if you want to silently mouth the words to yourself or to read under your breath, proctors may or may not allow that. Obviously with ProctorU, there have been some issues with that, so I wouldn't count on it. But if you can be very subtle about it, you might be okay. And then that's another way to at least, again, add the physical of your tongue and your lips moving. And then if you're very soft about it, maybe you're hearing a little bit of what you yourself are saying, that adds an auditory component as well. Again, proctors may crack down on that, so I'd be careful about counting on that. But the idea here is better retention comes from more sensory input and more physical acts to manifest the words that you're reading on the screen. The last thing I'll say here regarding drills and such is predicting or prephrasing. So I've talked about solving passages solely on based on your memory alone. I've talked about solving them based solely on your summaries of the main point or summaries of the passages. Combined with either of these, you could cover up all 5 answer choices and then write out what your predicted correct answer would be for a given question. So you're giving your articulation of the correct answer rather than LSAT's articulation. This is obviously most useful for main idea, primary purpose, author's opinion, passage organization, best title of the passage, best tone, all of those questions that are general in nature. So they're general, there's generally one major right answer there. It's not like which one of the following would the author be most likely to agree with, of which there could be 100 different things. So your prephrase is unlikely to be the exact answer because there are just too many directions they could have taken. But for anything general in nature, I would try predicting it, prephrasing it, writing it out on your scratch paper, then later checking it against what LSAT's articulation was and see how much does it line up and how much nicer is your wording than LSAT's wording. Obviously, yours will be much nicer, it'll be much more friendly, it'll be much more comprehensible, but can you match your wording to LSAT's boring version of what you're saying? And can you see that they really do mean the same thing? That's a better way to also make their wording real for you, to define it in a way from your innate understanding, not from like looking up definitions or looking up synonyms. Couple other things I'll mention here. I've covered this in the Reading Comp Masterclass from before, which I put the link in the chat, but a couple of things people often ask about are speed reading. So 2 tools for that are Spreeder and Phrase Reader. I've demoed them in the masterclass, so I'm not going to do that again. But basically the idea of both of those is you copy paste text from anywhere and put it into the field on those websites, those apps, and you can display it to yourself at different speeds. So if you, let's say you're comfortable at 300 words per minute, that's great. Display it to yourself at that speed and test yourself, and then increase it maybe 50 words per minute at a time. So from 300 words a minute to 350 words per minute. And over time, over the course of several weeks, you can train yourself to get faster and faster. And hopefully your retention and comprehension will maintain even at higher speeds. Obviously, the LSAT being as strictly timed as it is, anything faster you can do that still maintains comprehension is worth doing. I wouldn't devote too much time to this or obsess over it too much, but obviously every minute helps, every second helps. And so if you can get comfortable going faster, then do it. I would say inference questions are the closest to where you're going to have to read between the lines a little bit. Now, reading between the lines obviously becomes tricky because how much can you assume? And the answer is, as with so many questions on the LSAT, it's simply what is most supported, what is most likely to be the case. And there will always be some specific line reference you can point to that does support the given answer choice. But if they're asking a question as broad as which one of the following is the author most likely to agree with, there are many things the author is likely to agree with, just like any individual has plenty of things they would likely agree with. on all sorts of different matters. And so obviously it's narrowed to the 500 words or so that you'll see in the passage, but you've got to hunt and look for those things. If you can't prephrase because the question's as general as what I just laid out, then your alternative is process of elimination. So find the 4 things that are not supported at all, and then the one remaining choice, there will likely be some support somewhere in the passage. And this is where maybe Control F, Command F could come into play. For those who haven't heard, I've covered this a little bit, but LSAT Flex allows Control F or Command F, meaning as a keyboard commander function, you can search for specific keywords. I think the usefulness of this strategy is overplayed a little bit. I'm not sure how helpful that always will be in practice, but that is one of those other things you might experiment with that could save you a little bit of time when you're simply hunting for 1 out of 5 choices to find that key support there. But for most things, it will be looking for the details that support a given choice with key line references. You'll often hear it said, read a few lines above, a few lines below. Definitely do that. Also recognize that even if they're giving you a key direction, like in the past, it would be a line reference numbering. Now it'll be, like I said, the turquoise highlighting. The answer may not be exactly where that key term appears in the passage. They're referring to it as having appeared there, but it may appear elsewhere as well. So it may involve some very quick scanning up and down the passage, or for those who like Control F, potentially using Control F as well for the flex to jump to different places where it may appear, but it's all about context. You want to look for the patterns in tempting wrong answers. If it's complex wording, it's really just a question of post-game analysis, defining and reviewing to figure out what exactly they were getting at, which is where those summaries can come in handy. Then when you're looking for patterns in tempting wrong answers, you want to be thinking about things like which specific traps they're laying. So are they using statements that are rhyming with the passage, but maybe going a little bit more extreme, or maybe they're mixing in irrelevant information that wasn't supported by the passage, or if it was the exact opposite, so simply a negation in a sense, or a polar opposite where it's largely the same structure but going too far. There are lots of things like this. I have a list of them I'll put in the chat in terms of just various types of wrong answers. And this is not comprehensive, but it's a good starting point to think about where they could be going and seeing, okay, well, tempting wrong answer was wrong for this exact reason, and that's also why it seemed tempting. So just to read them off: extreme statements, irrelevant information, being the exact opposite, minor changes, illogical or random combinations, and then false attributions. So very similar in structure, very close in a lot of ways, but just crossing the line in one particular way. Just like in games, if there were a key rule that you misdiagrammed or got it backwards or missed something key, the whole game would be screwed, right? So the same thing happens in reading comp. If you don't really get the main idea, or even worse, you get the main idea backwards or distort it in some way, that's going to have a ripple effect throughout the entire passage. Like I said, for the global questions, there are a lot of global questions potentially: main idea, primary purpose, passage organization, best tone, best title. And so it all comes back to me with the main idea. That's the foundation for everything else. So as an exercise, what I described about the drill of just reading the passage, summarizing the main idea, and solving all the questions using only the main idea articulation as well as your memory, or a summary, summarizing the entire passage, maybe paragraph by paragraph, and then using that as your foundation. If you're missing something, then it's time to go back to the basics and see, were you correct in extracting the main idea? Were you correct in your summary? Not necessarily was your summary the best summary ever. Obviously, choosing certain details and not others will always be a judgment call, but simply, is your articulation correct in whatever you do write down? If there's one thing you summarize that is technically wrong, then you might get an answer wrong or get a question wrong because you're working off of faulty underlying assumptions. So to me, that's the key. Is it precise? And I notice this a lot in discussing any problem with any student. There will be little things they say that reveal a slight distortion from what is actually technically in the source material, whether it's most often it's in reading comp passages or in logical reasoning stimuli. And then I'll often hear it a lot with things like conditionality, where they'll mix up the if and then, which of course changes everything, right? And so the words you use really reveal the level of understanding and reveal any slight inaccuracies. And during one-on-one sessions with students especially, I'll often point out, oh, well, I know you meant this, but you said that. And it's really annoying when I do that, I know, but I do it for a reason, which is that it's all about wording. It's all about those technical little things. And so I'd say get to that level of granularity, and that makes a big difference. We had some questions here on just getting the main idea. And I think it's really looking for the author's opinion, ideally, if they express it, which they typically will. And so there will be certain words and phrases they use that will indicate that if they express a value judgment, like fortunately or unfortunately, that is in a way, like that's the voice of God, right? The fortunately or unfortunately, who thinks this? The author does. And so look for that. Look for those tonal words that make a difference. Or look for things like they're saying X should or Y should. This should be the case, or this should not, or this person does a good job of something, whatever it is. They may be expressing their opinion there, and that's probably pretty close to the main idea in some way, or at least relates to it. After you read the passage, take a moment to pause and think, what's the main idea? What's the author's opinion? And then if you like, doing some basic summaries of the passage, maybe focusing on the 3 paragraphs or so, whatever it is. Summaries don't always need to be paragraph specific. In fact, I've argued against that sometimes, but as a simple way to go about it, it's not terrible. Just to, again, as you said, either the examples the students did here, which were a bit more in depth, or simply a key word or key phrase more likely related to each paragraph, just as a roadmap or a thing you can refer back to. That's not as lengthy as the entire passage. So if you want to say, okay, well, details in paragraph 2, you'll know where to go back to find those details. And I think that extra moment at the beginning to kind of digest your understanding can actually save you time in the long run. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.